What do we have up to now? We linked the short-term nominal interest rate with the long-term nominal interest rate. We linked it with the real interest rate because inflation is sticky. And we can say that the central banks can control the short-term nominal, hence also the long-term real interest rate. This is our starting point for what comes next. So we've got here our typical graph with our IS curve that we had before the midterm exam already. And over here is the money market, and in the money market the central bank is active and they can choose. We are choosing a nominal short-term interest rate, the long-term real interest rate here by pushing this yellow line up and down, or you can also say that choose any point on the money demand curve here. So the central banks have pretty much full control what happens to the interest rate here. Good, at least in the simplified model. So what we can do is we can plot that interest rate over here. The way I did it is I said, well, we have positive inflation, so the real interest rate is a little bit lower than the nominal interest rate. But in lots of textbooks, you will see they just draw a straight line through. Same message. The message is whatever happens in the money market is having an impact here on our IS MP diagram. So we call this curve here, it doesn't come across nicely, MP curve. Why is that called MP curve? Basically is money market equilibrium, and we will see in a second it has to do with monetary policy as well. Good, so we've got here a new curve with this equation attached to it. You can see here in that equation there is no GDP gap. So it doesn't matter what the GDP is, the interest rate, the real interest rate is always the same constant. Only if the central bank is changing the nominal rate, then this whole blue line is changing up or down as well. Good. So how do the central bank actually decide the interest rates? And I think I found a nice video there where the RBA governor explains it himself, and he's actually explaining quite a lot of stuff that we talk about in this class. So it's nice to see that it has practical relevance. So I'll let him talk for 4 minutes.
The Reserve Bank's charter was written in 1959. It's broader than the charter of most other central banks. It's got 3 key elements. The Reserve Bank is responsible for low and stable inflation, for full employment, and promoting the general welfare of the Australian people.
So did you capture what is the RBA in charge of? What do they try to achieve? Low inflation, right? So you know in this class we don't want to talk about inflation. And what else? Low unemployment, that's what they're after. Not low employment, yes, thank you.
I'm glad we've got this broad mandate. As I said, it's broader than most other central banks. Many other central banks just have a mandate to control inflation. And in the end, low inflation is not the goal in and of itself. It's delivering low inflation to promote the economic prosperity of the Australian people. The Reserve Bank Board sets the cash rate on the first Tuesday of every month. The cash rate is the rate that banks use to lend to one another in the short-term money market. But it has a very large effect on mortgage rates in the economy, on the rates that people get on their savings, and affects asset prices and the exchange rate. So it's a very important interest rate. Sometimes we need to raise interest rates to achieve those objectives. If the economy is growing very strongly, demand's very buoyant, and that's pushing up prices, we might need to raise interest rates.
So try to keep certain things in the back of your mind because it's all related to what we're doing in the next in this hour. So it's number one, inflation he's looking at, but he also said if the economy is growing very fast, you might want to raise the interest rates as well. And we want to cover that in our model in a second as well.
Slow the economy to get things back onto an even keel. Conversely, if things are weak and demand is not very strong and inflation's low, we might need to lower interest rates to stimulate demand and get inflation back up towards the target. When we change interest rates, people obviously notice it in their mortgages, and that affects how much they spend. When rates are going up, they have less to spend, and when rates are going down, they have more to spend. Changes in the cash rate also affect the exchange rate. If we raise interest rates, the currency tends to appreciate, and when we lower interest rates, the currency tends to depreciate.
So appreciation, depreciation, we do in 2 weeks' time when we talk about the BP curve, also relates to this one.
Changes in interest rates can also affect people's confidence. In some circumstances, lower interest rates makes people feel happier. In other cases, higher interest rates make people feel less happy, and so that affects their spending. Changes in interest rates also affect asset prices. When we have lower interest rates, that tends to push up asset prices, and if asset prices are higher, people might feel wealthier, and if they're wealthier, they might spend more, and conversely, if higher rates might mean lower asset prices, and people don't feel as confident, they don't spend as much. Our board is made up of mainly outside people. They're either business people or people who have experience in other areas of public policy or public service. And I think that's really valuable. What I notice about business people and people who have the broader experience is they're very good at making decisions under uncertainty. And much of what the Reserve Bank Board is doing is making a very important decision in a quite an uncertain world. So we're trading off things all the time, and we're trying to make the best decision in the best welfare of the people of Australia. And the business people and people with outside expertise are very good at doing that. I dare say they're actually better doing it than economists. So I like...
That's of course not correct, right? So don't get the wrong message out of that one.
Kind of having this broad perspective on our board. I think it also helps the legitimacy and the public accountability of the board. It's much better to have interest rate decisions made by this broad group of people rather than primarily made by technical academic economists. So I'm a strong fan of our current board structure, although it's quite different from the boards of most other central banks. At a very practical level, we operate a flexible medium-term inflation target. Our objective is to deliver an average rate of inflation for the community of between 2 and 3% over time.
2 and 3% over time for inflation rate, right? So that's the target. They're not always on target, but that's, remember when we talked about inflation, we said to low and steady inflation, that's their target.
We're prepared to allow the inflation rate to move up and down over time, but we want people to be confident that over time, inflation in Australia will be 2 point something. And if people are confident of that, they can go about making their decisions about saving, investment and spending with assurance that inflation will be low and stable. The value of their money will be protected because it won't be eroded by inflation, and they can have certainty about what the price level will do over time.
Good. So basically what we do now is we back that up with a model. So I copied that down from the RBA. I should have written down here RBA2. It's basically from their website. Price stability, low and steady inflation rates. That's what we're after. Price stability doesn't mean zero inflation, but just as you said, 2 point something, right? That's target number 1 for most central banks in the world. So the ECB has a target similar to that one too. They might not spell it out that loud. And in the US, the Fed as well. And target number 2 is stabilize the economy. So we don't want to have huge unemployment rates. We don't want to have financial crisis. So that's the second target. He said, well, we're looking at inflation 2 to 3%, but we also look at unemployment. We want that people have jobs. So goal number 2 of the central bank was we look at the economic activity. And that wasn't in our model beforehand, but we can include it. We can say, well, the central bank is setting the interest rate not only because of inflation, but also because the economy is either running excessively hot, so then the gap is positive, then we're on the right, or the economy is underperforming, we would have high unemployment then, so then the GDP gap would be negative. And you can see here, so if the economy is underperforming, under potential, negative GDP gap, hence the interest rate should go down. And not because of inflation in this moment, simply because the economy is going lower. The central bank would decrease the interest rate. So here they have 2 goals now. They've got the goal, steady inflation and keeping the economy on track. And these goals can be, of course, sometimes contradictory. So it depends upon if there's more focus on M or more focus on N. Right? So these 2 variables here are basically saying, are you more of a dove, and doves are looking less at inflation and more at the unemployment number? Or are you more of a hawk? And hawks don't care that much about unemployment, they care much more about inflation. So these 2, M, N, are deciding this one. So ceteris paribus, if nothing else changes, they would increase if the economy is booming. So if this one is big, R gets bigger, and vice versa. Everybody on board with these words? Decided to put a little bit more of specialized words into the class. Ceteris paribus, heard that before? So that means everything else equal, vice versa, and the other way around. So these things you will see often in macro texts or economics all up. Good, Taylor rule. So that is called also the Taylor rule when we add not only inflation into the monetary policy rule, but also GDP, so-called Taylor rule. And that's what we want to try to do now. Now, the Taylor rule is a little bit more tricky than the other one that we had before. Before, on the hand, we could just draw a straight line here because the central bank is just setting the interest rate depending on inflation, but there's no inflation in this diagram here, right? So it doesn't matter what GDP is, it would be just a straight line. Now, of course, we've got GDP in here, and you've got it on your printouts already, so the slope is positive, right? And the slope is affected by n here. So you can imagine the bigger n, the steeper the slope would be of that new curve. The smaller n, the lower the slope. Extreme curve, if n is 0, then the curve would have exactly a slope of 0, right? Then we will be in the old case that we just said before, and if we send n 0. Good, so now it's an upward sloping curve, and that's changing certain things a little bit, makes also some things a little bit more tricky. The ice curve stays the same. Now, if we change the ice curve, let's say we've got a shock like the export shock that we just said beforehand. Beforehand, we shifted the ice curve to the right, and we just shifted the AD curve to the right, and the interest rates didn't change. Now, of course, if we shift it to the right, something is happening here. And I think I've got that as a U-turn one. Yes, very good. Because in the end, don't stress too much. So this is in gray. That means you don't have to memorize or learn how to derive these things. This is just a proof that I can reshuffle everything to end up with this equation here. Good, but this one is important because it's tricky. So we have an export shock, and now the question is, how do we get to this thing? If you plot a graph with time on one axis and GDP on the other axis, how does it look like? We know already, well, GDP is going to jump up straight away with the exports a little bit. But then the question is, well, will it continue to rise? Will it go straight? Think of the multiplier, right? Because the export companies are receiving money now, so they might spend more money on other people, there's more income, you get the multiplier effect, and so on. But we can also see in the graph something else changes. Interest rate is changing. That might affect investments as well. So scratch your head how you might graph that over time. And I can tell you something else maybe that might be interesting. Let's call this crossing point A. This point here, B. And this point here, C. And scratch your head a little bit through which points the economy might run. So the starting point here is we have a positive shock on exports, that's our increase in Chinese exports. In our equation over there on the other side, that would be A. A head is increasing, right? That's where all the shocks are. And that's an immediate, discrete, strong increase here. And now the multiplier kicks in, right? So because the exports firm have more income, they pay to other people income, and they go more shopping, and so on. Remember that with the C, it goes round and round and round and round, and GDP goes up and up and up and more and more. So what we have here is basically, I'll make it like this, a little bit up, and the idea is we've got positive export shock, therefore we've got like the one aggregate demand goes up, and then we had GDP goes up, and because GDP goes up, our consumption goes up, and that goes in a circle depending on how strong the multiplier is. So that's a positive one, and that would say that we should keep on increasing here a little bit, right? So that is, we are moving clearly towards the right. So far, so good. But as soon as we are starting moving a little bit to the right, now the central bank kicks in. And the central bank says here, oh, well, if our economy is overheating, they start raising the interest rate. That means we're staying on the blue line. So money markets are very, very fast. So basically, we are always on the blue line. We can't be off the blue line. We can be off our ice curve a little bit in between. That is possible, but we can't be off our blue line. So now, as soon as we're going a little bit to the right, now the interest rates are going to increase a little bit. So that's basically coming from here with our Taylor rule now. Because of this one, the central bank is increasing the interest rate. And that is, of course, causing investment to come down and GDP to come down a little bit. And then the question is, which of the two impacts here is stronger? Right? Now, if this impact would be stronger than that one, and that relates to, now I'm clicking a little bit better, then we would starting to go backwards again. Then they would start decreasing the interest rate here again. Right? So we have to take these two impacts here together. And if you look at the graph here, at that interest rate, we are not finished with our positive growth, right? We are still going towards the ice curve here. So we're still moving towards the right, and the interest rate keep on going higher and higher and higher. That basically means that our top loop here, the positive loop, is a little bit stronger than the negative loop that we have here. Otherwise, we wouldn't go further to the right and get higher and higher interest rates. Right? If this loop was too weak, we would start going towards the left early on again, and then the central bank would start decreasing the interest rate again. Make sense? And that's the reason why the economy here, initially positive shock, then due to the multiplier we are growing. But let's make two different graphs. So usually the multiplier would look like this, tapering out. But now because the interest rate is increasing, the impact is weaker. Make sense? So also the economy is not going as high as if the central bank was not reacting. Remember, if the central bank is not reacting, we would just be standing here on the horizontal line, and we would reach this top GDP here, much, much higher GDP. But because now the central bank is reacting, increasing the interest rate, we are dampening the whole system here a little bit, and we don't get as high up anymore. Because the interest rates are higher, and we call that also, if the interest rates are higher, and therefore one part of the economy is shrinking while the other one is still increasing, it's called, if the room is very full, we are crowding out some people. So it's crowding out. Right? In this case here, crowding out by the central bank. Usually we crowd out by other reasons, but that's easy enough. So watch out. Some textbooks actually do it. A, B, C. But I feel very strong that doesn't fly, because we never reach that point B here. We would reach point B only if the interest rate would have not been changed. But it's very, very unlikely that the central bank is waiting that long and changes the interest rate only at the very end and then crashes the economy into recession.
What about central banks make decisions on a monthly basis?
Very good point. So central banks, remember, one of their main point is that they're targeting inflation and also the economy. But month on month, how much does the economy change? Hardly any. Right? Same thing with sticky inflation. However, there are special times where the economy does change month on month. And what does the central bank then do? Do they wait till next Tuesday? Nah, right? So if there's a big earthquake in the US, in New York, the stock exchange crashes, there's a catastrophe there, be assured the central bankers are meeting within hours. Right? Same thing when they had GFC, they just meet all the time. So they usually have, if everything is normal, their Tuesday meeting and announcement. But if something really is demanding their attention, they're not saying it's not Tuesday yet, right? They're meeting. That will work. So today we introduced the central bank to our model. We did so by assuming that inflation is pretty sticky, so any change in the nominal interest rate was affecting the real interest rate. The real interest rate was of course important with the ice curve, with the investment decision of real companies. So this is depicted by the ice curve. Now we introduce the MP curve, which is depicting the central bank behavior and central bank reactions. In math terms, this is shown by the Taylor rule, which includes the central bank's reaction to inflation, which we'll talk about more in the future, and the central bank reactions to current GDP gap.